The judge's voice echoed through the tense silence of the Virginia courthouse, sealing a man's fate with a single sentence: 1 year in prison. For most, it would be a punishment. But for the man standing before the bench, the patriarch of the most powerful clan in these mountains, it was a declaration of war. He was a man who swore he would never spend a single day in a cage. And in that moment, as he uttered his final defiant words, the law of the state collided head-on with the ancient code of the mountains. The courtroom, a place of order, erupted into a hell of gunfire, smoke, and screams. They say it was a massacre, a brutal assault on justice by a lawless family of bootleggers. But the old-timers in these hills, they still tell a different story. A story of honor, betrayal, and a trap that was sprung the moment that verdict was read. So, what really happened in that Hillsville courthouse? Was this a cold-blooded slaughter carried out by a ruthless criminal, or was it the last, desperate battle of a proud man who refused to be broken? Today, we're going to separate the facts from the legends and find out what led to one of the bloodiest shootouts in American history. To understand the explosion of violence that day, you first have to understand the world it came from. Carroll County, Virginia, at the turn of the 20th century, wasn't just a place on a map. It was a kingdom unto itself, walled off by the ancient, haze-covered peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Down in the valleys and hollows, life moved to a different rhythm. It was a world where a man's worth was measured not by the money in his pocket, but by the strength of his word and the loyalty of his kin. The forests provided everything you needed to survive, and the creeks ran with water so clear it could wash away your sins. This was a land with its own unwritten constitution, a code carved into the hearts of its people over generations. Family was the first and last commandment. An insult to one was an insult to all, a debt that would be paid one way or another. Honor was the only currency that mattered, and a public shaming was a fate worse than death itself. And the most sacred law of all was a deep, abiding suspicion of outsiders, especially the government men from the flatlands, with their strange laws and their pieces of paper that meant nothing in the face of mountain justice. At the heart of this kingdom, there was a king. His name was Floyd Allen. At 55 years old, Floyd was more than just a wealthy landowner with a sawmill and a few stores. He was the patriarch, the lawgiver, the final authority in his corner of the mountains. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, you didn't go to the sheriff in Hillsville, you went to Floyd Allen. He was a man forged from the mountain itself, hard, unyielding, with a temper as quick as a summer storm. He'd been in dozens of fights and more than a few shootouts, but he had, as they said, never run from anyone in his life. He was feared, yes, but he was also respected as the living embodiment of Appalachian pride. His son, Claude, was cut from a different cloth. Where Floyd was the old world, Claude was a glimpse of a possible new one. He was handsome, intelligent, and educated. He had dreams of becoming an engineer, of building a life beyond the confines of the family land and the endless cycle of mountain feuds. He loved his father. He respected the code he was raised on, but a part of him longed to escape it, to prove that an Allen could make his way in the modern world without a gun on his hip. He was caught between the past and the future, a son loyal to a father whose world was already beginning to crumble. Because change was coming to Carroll County, whether the Allens wanted it or not. It came in the form of new roads being cut through the hills, new telegraph lines buzzing with messages from the outside world, and new men like Judge Thornton Massey. These were men who believed in a different kind of law, one that was written down in books and applied the same to everyone, whether you were a poor farmer or the unofficial king of the mountains. They didn't understand the old ways, and they had no intention of respecting them. The modern world was knocking on Floyd Allen's door, and it wasn't asking for permission to enter. It was coming to take everything he stood for. The coming storm didn't gather overnight. For years, the tension between the Allens' world and the state's authority had been building, like a slow poison seeping into the soil of Carroll County. On one side stood Floyd Allen, a living relic of a time when a man's power was absolute within the shadow of his own mountain. On the other side were men like Judge Thornton Massey and Sheriff Lewis Webb. They weren't just court officials, they were missionaries of a new faith, the religion of codified law, and they saw Floyd Allen as the defiant high priest of an old pagan order that had to be broken. The community itself was a patchwork of quiet loyalties and unspoken resentments. For every family that owed Floyd a favor, for a loan given when the bank refused, or for a dispute settled with a quiet word instead of a costly lawyer, there was another that nursed a secret grudge. Perhaps it was a land deal where they felt they'd been strong-armed, or a public argument where they'd been forced to back down from Floyd's cold stare. These people didn't dare speak out, but they watched from their porches, silently praying for the day the law would finally do what they never could: humble the king of Carroll County. This wasn't the first time Floyd Allen had brushed up against the law, but it was the first time the law refused to blink. In the past, his altercations had always ended the mountain way, with a handshake, an intimidation, or a fine that was little more than a slap on the wrist. Each time he walked away, his legend grew, and the authority of the courthouse in Hillsville shrank. To Judge Massey and his allies, these weren't just isolated incidents, they were a pattern of deliberate defiance. Floyd's reputation was a challenge to their very existence, and they knew that for their law to truly rule these mountains, the Allen law had to be brought to its knees. As news of Floyd's arrest for freeing his nephews spread, the air in the hollows and on the streets of Hillsville grew electric with gossip. Talk in the general store would drop to a whisper when a known Allen sympathizer walked in. Sides were being chosen, not with words, but with averted eyes and silent nods. Rumors flew like sparks from a blacksmith's forge that the judge had sworn on a Bible to see Floyd in chains, that the Allens were stockpiling ammunition in their mountain home. Every story, whether true or false, was another piece of dry kindling being stacked at the courthouse door. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a simple assault charge anymore. It was a reckoning. And the only thing left to wonder was who would be the one to finally strike the match. Tragedy in the mountains rarely starts with a thunderclap. More often, it begins with a spark, a seemingly small event that lands on the dry tinder of old resentments. In this case, the spark was a fistfight between two of Floyd's nephews, Sidner and Wesley Edwards, during a church service. It was a common enough affair, a flare-up of young tempers. But this time was different. This time, a deputy sheriff stepped in, and the fight ended not with a grudging handshake, but with the cold click of handcuffs. When word reached Floyd Allen, a cold fury settled over him. It wasn't that he believed his nephews were innocent lambs. It was the principle of the thing. The law of the Flatlands had reached into his family and laid its hands on his blood. To Floyd, this was an intolerable trespass, an insult to his authority and his name. He wasn't about to let his kin be dragged down to Hillsville and paraded before a court that held no meaning for him. He saddled his horse and went to settle things the only way he knew how. He intercepted the deputy on a lonely mountain road. The scene was pure mountain drama. The patriarch, his face set like granite, blocking the path of the law. He didn't ask or plead. He demanded the immediate release of his nephews. When the deputy, a brave or foolish man, refused to back down, Floyd Allen did what he had always done. He closed the distance, wrenched the pistol from the lawman's own holster, and beat him senseless with the butt of it. As the deputy lay stunned in the dirt, the Edwards boys vanished back into the woods, free men once more. In Floyd's world, the matter was settled. An insult had been answered, his family's honor was restored, and the law had been put back in its place. But down in Hillsville, his actions were seen as an act of open rebellion. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was an armed assault on a state officer. For Judge Massey and the county authorities, this was the final straw. They had endured the Allens' defiance for years, but this brazen attack could not be ignored. The law didn't just come for the nephews this time, it came for the king. A warrant was issued, and a posse rode into the mountains with one target: Floyd Allen. His arrest was a spectacle, a shockwave that rattled every cabin in Carroll County. The untouchable patriarch was being dragged to jail like a common thief. For the state, it was a long overdue victory for order. But for Floyd Allen, it was the ultimate humiliation, a stain on his honor that could only be washed away with blood. As he sat in his cell, awaiting trial, he made a solemn vow to anyone who would listen. "If they convict me, I won't spend a day in prison." The battle lines were drawn. The courthouse in Hillsville was no longer just a place of law. It was about to become a battlefield. On March 14, 1912, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grim. The foreman's voice cut through the suffocating tension, delivering the verdict: guilty. And the sentence: 1 year in the state penitentiary. For Floyd Allen, a man who measured his life by the respect he commanded, those words were not a sentence, but an execution order for his honor. A year in a cage, surrounded by common criminals, was a humiliation he simply would not endure. Judge Massey, his voice steady, asked if the defendant had anything to say. Floyd Allen rose to his feet. Every eye in the crowded room was fixed on him. A deep, unnatural silence fell, a silence so profound you could hear the dust motes dancing in the shafts of winter light. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on the judge, the sheriff, and the prosecutor. Then he spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "I ain't a-goin'." And in the space of a heartbeat, the world ended. To this day, no one agrees on what happened next. The Allens would later swear the sheriff drew his weapon first. The court officials would testify that Floyd's hand was the first to move toward his coat. But what is known for certain is that a single deafening crack of a pistol shattered the stillness, and the Hillsville courthouse was plunged into hell. The first shot was followed by a second, then a third, until the room was filled with an unbroken roar of gunfire. It was a storm of lead unleashed in a small enclosed space, a terrifying thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The air filled with acrid gun smoke, so thick it burned the eyes and choked the lungs. People screamed, a single sustained sound of pure terror as they scrambled for their lives, diving under heavy oak benches and crawling over one another in a desperate bid for safety. Wood splintered from the walls and the jury box. The terrible wet thud of bodies hitting the floorboards was almost lost in the chaos. This wasn't a gunfight. It was a bedlam of close-quarters savagery, where friend and foe were obscured by a grey, stinging fog. When the last echo of gunfire finally faded, a ringing silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. On the judge's bench, Thornton Massey was slumped forward in his high-backed chair, the voice of the state's law silenced forever. Near the door, Sheriff Lewis Webb lay on the floor, his own pistol still half drawn from its holster. Out on the courthouse steps, Prosecutor William Foster had collapsed, his life bleeding out onto the cold stone. A juror was dead in his seat, an innocent witness cut down where she stood. The aftermath was a scene of unbelievable carnage. The walls of the courtroom were scarred with more than 50 bullet holes, silent witnesses to 90 seconds of absolute mayhem. Empty brass casings littered the floor like fallen leaves after a storm. And through the haze and the stunned silence of the survivors, the figures of the Allen clan moved like ghosts. They didn't run. They walked, with purpose, out of the slaughterhouse they had created, mounted their waiting horses, and melted back into the mountains that had always been their sanctuary and their fortress. The law of the flatlands lay dead on the floor, and the law of the mountains had escaped, leaving behind a river of blood. For a long moment after the Allens disappeared, the only sound in the Hillsville courthouse was the ragged breathing of the living and the soft groans of the dying. The thick, grey smoke began to clear revealing a scene from a nightmare. The high-backed judge's chair was empty, its occupant slumped forward onto his desk. The floorboards were slick with blood. Overturned benches and scattered legal papers lay strewn among the wounded and the dead. The law itself was lying on the floor, bleeding from a dozen wounds. Slowly, shakily, the first survivors began to stir. They were dazed, their ears ringing, their faces pale with a horror that would never fully leave them. They were clerks, lawyers, and ordinary townspeople who had come to witness a trial and had instead become witnesses to a slaughter. They stumbled out onto the courthouse steps, their clothes stained with the blood of others, their eyes wide and unseeing. The crowd that had gathered outside, drawn by the thunder of the gunfire, fell silent as they saw the carnage firsthand. The truth of what had just happened spread not by word, but by a wave of collective shock and terror. Inside, a desperate, futile effort was underway to save who could be saved. Sheriff Webb was still breathing, but a bullet had torn through him, and everyone knew his time was short. He would die the next day, becoming another casualty of the Allens War. Prosecutor Foster bled out on the courthouse steps, his life pooling on the very spot where he was meant to uphold the law. The final count was staggering. 5 dead, including the judge, the sheriff, the prosecutor, a juror, and a witness. 7 more were wounded. In less than 2 minutes, the entire judicial system of Carroll County had been decapitated. The news of the massacre didn't just spread through the mountains, it exploded across the country. Telegraph wires hummed with the story, and newspaper headlines screamed of war in Virginia and Appalachian savagery. What had been a local power struggle was now a national outrage. This was no longer about a bootlegger defying a local court. It was a full-blown insurrection, a bloody challenge to the authority of the state and the nation. The reaction from the state capital in Richmond was swift and furious. The governor declared it an act of anarchy and vowed to bring the full might of the state down on Carroll County. He didn't just send a posse, he mobilized a private army. The infamous Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a ruthless band of union-busting mercenaries known for their brutality and efficiency, was hired to hunt the Allens down. A massive reward was placed on their heads, enough money to make a poor mountain farmer forget a lifetime of loyalty. It was an act of war, and the state of Virginia was about to answer in kind. The mountains that had once been the Allens' sanctuary were about to become their hunting ground. An army of strangers descended on Carroll County. They were not the familiar faces of local law enforcement. They were the Baldwin Felts detectives, professionals in the art of the manhunt, with eyes as cold as the steel of their revolvers. They came with a mandate from the governor and a singular purpose: to drag the Allens out of their mountain fortress, dead or alive. With them came the promise of a massive reward, a fortune that whispered temptation into the ear of every farmer and storekeeper, testing the limits of old loyalties and turning the entire county into a web of potential informants. At first, the mountains held their own. The Allens, wounded from the firefight during their escape, vanished into the familiar embrace of the hollows and ridges they knew better than the lines on their own hands. The mountains that had birthed them now conspired to hide them. The detectives, for all their professionalism, were outsiders in this terrain. They were clumsy, loud, and easily misled. Locals would offer vague directions that led to dead ends or simply shrug with a vacant stare, their silence a more formidable wall than any mountain peak. For days, the posse crashed through the underbrush, chasing ghosts and rumors, while the Allens remained shadows. But the Baldwin Felts men were relentless. They were not bound by the unwritten rules of mountain courtesy. They applied pressure, methodically, squeezing the community until it began to crack. They set up checkpoints, searched homes, and interrogated families known to be sympathetic to the Allens. The vast wilderness that had been a sanctuary for the fugitives slowly began to feel like a trap. For Floyd and Claude, hiding with festering gunshot wounds, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Every snapped twig sounded like a rifle cocking. They couldn't rest, they couldn't heal. They were being hunted. The end came not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, exhausted corner of their own kingdom. A tip, bought with state money, led the detectives to a small grist mill where Floyd and his son Claude had taken refuge. There was no final, desperate shootout. The posse surrounded the building at dawn, their rifles aimed, their voices calling for surrender. The door creaked open, and the two men emerged, not as defiant kings, but as wounded animals cornered at last. They were a shadow of their former selves. Floyd, the unbending patriarch, was pale and weakened from his wounds, his famous temper replaced by a grim resignation. Claude, the young man who had dreamed of a different life, looked aged by a decade, the weight of his loyalty and his actions heavy on his shoulders. There was no fight left in them. In their eyes was neither remorse nor rage, only the bottomless exhaustion of men who know their road has finally come to its end. The law of the mountains had been broken, its champions captured, and now they were being taken down to the flatlands to face the justice they had so bloodily defied. The trial of the Allens was a national sensation. It was moved from the blood-soaked courthouse in Hillsville to the town of Wytheville, under the pretense of finding an impartial jury, but everyone knew the real reason: to put the Allens on the state stage, far from their mountain kingdom. The courthouse was surrounded by armed guards, a fortress in the middle of town. Reporters from newspapers in New York and Chicago packed the press benches, eager to send dispatches about the savage mountaineers. The trial was a foregone conclusion masquerading as due process. It was not about determining guilt, but about staging a public ritual of state power. In the defendant's chair, Floyd Allen was not a broken man. He was defiant. With his arm in a sling from the gunshot wound he'd sustained, he faced the court not with remorse, but with the unwavering conviction of a man who believed his actions were justified. He had been defending his honor and his family, the two pillars of his entire existence. His testimony was a masterclass in mountain logic, a declaration that the court's laws did not apply to a man's sacred duty to his kin. Beside him sat Claude, a tragic and somber figure. His silence was more profound than his father's defiance, the posture of a man trapped by a code he had tried to escape, now facing death for a loyalty he could not betray. The prosecution painted a simple, brutal picture. The Allens were cold-blooded assassins who had planned a massacre to escape justice. Their lawyers countered with the only defense they had, the story that would become the central myth of the Allen clan, that Sheriff Webb had fired the first shot, and the Allens had only defended themselves from a premeditated trap. But in a courtroom filled with public outrage and a jury box filled with men of the flatlands, their arguments were like whispers in a hurricane. The physical evidence, the dead judge, the dead sheriff, the bullet-riddled walls, screamed louder than any legal defense. The verdict, when it came, was swift and predictable: guilty. The sentence was even more so. Not the hangman's rope, the old-world method of justice. Floyd Allen and his son Claude were sentenced to die in the electric chair. It was a modern, scientific, and terrifying death, a symbol of the new century's power to extinguish the old. The state wasn't just going to execute them, it was going to demonstrate its complete and total dominance over the old mountain ways. But a strange thing happened as the date of their execution approached. Thousands of letters and petitions flooded the governor's office, pleading for clemency. These were not just from mountain folk. They were from people all across the country who saw the Allens not as murderers, but as symbols of a dying American spirit of independence, proud men pushed too far by an arrogant system. They saw the massacre not as an act of evil, but as a tragic last stand. The governor, however, remained unmoved. The state's honor had been challenged, and blood had to be paid with blood. And so the central question remained, hanging in the air long after the trial was over. Was this truly justice? Or was it simply revenge, carried out with a gavel and a switch to make an example of the last king of the mountains? The execution of Floyd and Claude Allen was not the end of the story. It was the end of an era. The iron grip of the Allen clan on Carroll County was shattered forever. The other family members involved were hunted down, tried, and sent to prison. The power of the old mountain code had been publicly broken, and the state's law, backed by electricity and steel, had proven its dominance. The Allen name, once spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, was now whispered with the heavy weight of tragedy. But the past is never truly gone in these mountains. It just sinks a little deeper into the soil. If you travel to Hillsville, Virginia today, you can stand on the very ground where the blood was spilled. The old brick courthouse still stands, a silent monument to that day of wrath. Locals will tell you that if you look closely at the brickwork around the entrance, you can still find the pockmarks where stray bullets struck, patched over but never fully erased, scars on the face of justice itself. They say at night, when the town is quiet, you can almost hear the echoes of the gunfire, a ghost of a sound that the wind has never quite carried away. Not far from there, in a quiet family cemetery tucked away in the hills, lie the graves of Floyd and Claude Allen. There are no grand statues, no lengthy epitaphs detailing their deeds, just simple stones marking the final resting place of a father and son who died for a code that the world had left behind. But their story didn't just turn to stone and dust, it turned to music. The Ballad of Floyd Allen became a fixture of Appalachian folk tradition, a haunting melody that tells the story from his point of view, preserving the legend of a proud man who refused to bend. The court records in Richmond tell one version of the story. The newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, tell another. But here, in the shadow of the Blue Ridge, the real story is still alive. It lives in the names on the gravestones, in the notes of an old song, and in the whispers of the old-timers who heard the tale from their own grandfathers. The world has moved on, building highways over the old mountain roads. But the mountains have a long memory, and they remember everything. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning, standing in the shadow of that old courthouse. Was Floyd Allen a cold-blooded murderer who led a calculated assault on the law? Or was he the last chieftain of a dying world, making a final bloody stand for the only code he had ever known? The truth, like most things in these mountains, is not a simple thing. The court records will tell you he was a killer, and from the perspective of the law, they are not wrong. But that's only half the story. The Hillsville massacre was more than just a shootout. It was a violent, painful birth. It was the moment the 20th century dragged Carroll County, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. This is a story not just of cruelty, but of the indomitable Appalachian spirit, a spirit that values family over government, honor over life, and loyalty over law. Floyd Allen's actions were brutal and indefensible, but they came from a place of profound, unbending pride that the outside world could never hope to understand. He lost his war, but in his defiance, he became a permanent symbol of that fierce, stubborn resilience. This story serves as a chilling reminder that progress is rarely a peaceful process. Before the law of the state could take root in these hills, the law of the mountains had to be uprooted, and that process was written in gunpowder and blood. The price for one unified system of justice was paid for by the lives lost on that courtroom floor. It was the bloody end of an era, and the final desperate gasp of a world that refused to die quietly. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. No,